What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we have a new set, Synchro Storm is out, and now we're gonna take a look at, I think it's probably the most exciting deck out of those three, because all of those decks that we've seen during the past with Tri-Brigades, this is one of those versions that we used to see, but now it's kind of come and gone. I mean, people don't play it anymore, people just play Zoo because it's so much superior, but I think Lyrilusc have the potential to become a really strong deck, and I know that a lot of people are just bored at this point of seeing Tri-Brigade, so this is why I'm presenting you today a pure Lyrilusc version. If you want to play the Tri-Brigades, you already know what decks and what kind of other cards you should be playing in the deck if you want to incorporate that engine, so I don't think there's any need for us to cover that deck. But for a pure version, I think that the deck already has a lot of ways to play as a pure deck, even without the Tri-Brigades. Of course, the Tri-Brigades do offer a lot, but I think the pure version is actually more fun, at least for me, just because the deck actually now has a lot of plays compared to the past, where it only had a play to go for Assembled Nightingale and go for an OTK. Now it can go first, it can go second, it can do so much more. So, before we begin, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off with the monsters, we have of course 3 copies of Lyrilusc Turquoise Warbler. Some of the monsters are usually the ones that special summon themselves or the ones that special summon other monsters. This is basically the whole concept of the deck, which opens the door for a lot of other cards that you can play in the deck. So this card, basically, if you control the monsters, you can special summon it, and when it's special summoned, you can special summon a Lyrilusc from your hand or your graveyard. Being able to summon those monsters for free means that you can basically choose a normal summon for the deck that is not reliant on the archetype, because the deck doesn't really have a dedicated normal summon. Yes, you can basically normal summon any of them, but since all of them have a way to special summon themselves, except just one, but this is the one you want to be special summoning mainly with all those other effects, you can just pick and choose another normal summon from, and I'll show you the one that I've chosen. There are a couple, but I think this one's the best. But for now, Turquoise Warbler is the one that you want to start your plays with, because it's the only one that has a very restrictive condition on when you can summon it, so it has to be the first thing. So if you don't do it first and you see it later, maybe you will not be able to use this effect. And there is another way to trigger it, but still it's a little bit difficult to make all those plays if you don't start with Warbler, because when you go for the normal summon, you want to use your Warbler first, because otherwise you won't be able. 3 copies of Cobalt Sparrow. I think this card is the most important monster in the deck, even after getting all the support. I think this card on paper is the one that makes the biggest difference, just because the effect that to make the Xyz monster that is it's untargetable makes it so that your monster, your Robin, that is going to give you all the interruptions now with all those bounces, means that it's not going to just lose to an impermanence or a card like that. So this card, not only does it give you the protection you need against certain cards, but it also searches you your Lyrilusc monsters when it's special summoned. So this is a card that, even though it doesn't have a way to special summon itself, it's the one that you want to be special summoning with all those other effects that you have 99% of the time, because it gives you the most advantage. So this is why this card is the one you want to see either in your hand or in your grave as fast as possible, which is another reason why the Tri-Brigade engine makes a lot of sense in this deck, just because even if you have the Tri-Brigades in your hand, there is another really good target you can send to the graveyard, that being Cobalt Sparrow. But still, I decided to make a pure version just because I think that a lot of people are just fed up with the Tri-Brigade engine. I mean, we've been seeing it for such a long time. So yeah, Cobalt Sparrow, you should prioritize her, getting her to the graveyard if you don't have her in your hand, and then get her to the field with one of those other effects. 3 copies of Sapphire Swallow. This is another card that just extends from the hand. You reveal it if you control a winged beast, you special summon it, and another monster from your hand. You can spam this with this deck so much, and this is why I think that the deck has a lot of potential going first as well, because of another card that is a very essential card when you're playing a winged beast deck, which I'll show you later, that makes any type of deck like this very resilient. Basically, it's the own version of Crossout Designator, but just 10 times better for specific deck like this. So yeah, this card, another extender, great card, you have to max it out. Now, going on to the new stuff, we have 3 copies of Celeste Wagtails. So this card is the searcher for your spell and traps, because Cobalt Sparrow searched your monsters, so we did need a spell and trap searcher and something that can actually give us good searches, because before we didn't have a spell and trap in the deck to search, but now we do have really good cards to search. So when this card is special summoned, you can add a little spell and trap from your deck to your hand. So you have to special summon it, which is a bit of a bummer, just because if you could normal summon this and search, it would be so great, but you have to combine with something else in order to be able to get the search, but still not the greatest of deals. So this card, along with Sapphire Swallow that I showed you before, do have 2 effects that might not seem too impactful, but honestly, when you play the deck, when you want to master this deck, these kinds of effects make a huge difference. So basically, when this card is in the graveyard, you can target a Lyrilusc Xyz monster you control and attach this card from the grave as material. And also, Sapphire Swallow has another effect that I forgot to mention, that when you Xyz summon with it, you can target a Lyrilusc monster in your graveyard and attach it to it as material. So when you use these effects, you have to be very careful on which cards you detach, especially from the Xyz monster that searches, the Recital Starlight, because you want to get the specific monsters in the graveyard so that they can put themselves back to other Xyz monsters materials, because the more materials you have on your Xyz monsters in this deck, the more damage you can do, the more interruptions you can make. It just makes a lot of sense. So you just just want to be able to use your Swallow as material to can get another one, and then get your Wagtail to the graveyard so you can get it back on its own from the graveyard as material to just give you more interruptions and more attacks with your assembled Nightingale. 3 copies of Barrel Canary. This is another card that people were a lot of hype for this card, but the problem is that this card just locks you into Xyz monsters. So aside from a pure version of the deck, if you're trying to play with Tri-Brigades, this might be a little bit restrictive just because you want to go into links, and especially when you go into your Bear Bloom, you want to use its effect, but it locks you in Tri-Brigades. So this is why the deck right now, if you want to play it at its maximum potential, I don't think it has the greatest synergy with Tri-Brigades. It has a lot, but sometimes it can clog, and this is one of the reasons why. But this card in the pure version is absolutely incredible. So this card just special summon itself from the hand, and then you special summon one from the graveyard. So yeah, these cards just get themselves on the field and get other monsters on the field as well. This is basically a theme of the deck, and it also has an effect that boosts the attack of your Xyz monsters when you Xyz summon with this card. It gains 200 attack, and this might not seem like a lot, but when you count that assembled Nightingale can attack 4, 5, or sometimes even 6 times, then yes, it does make a lot of difference for the OTKs, because there are other ways to boost your monsters as well. So the more attack points a monster can attack so many times can have, then the better it is for you to be able to OTK with as few materials as possible, because sometimes your plays might get interrupted and you won't be able to get so many materials under your assembled Nightingale, and this is one of those cards that helps you boost her so you can attack directly for game. Now, my normal summon of choice is 3 copies of Kinkabayo, and there are other options. One that comes to mind is Evil Thorn, basically anything related to level 1 monsters. Mystic Piper is another one that can be a little bit of a gambling card, but sometimes it can pay off big time. But I think this card is the best one just because it just focuses so much on Cobalt Sparrow, and this is the main focus of the deck. If you can get those searches, then this basically means that you're going to win the duel, because you don't play that many monsters. If you think about it, it's 18 monsters that you want to see in your hand, and you won't be able to spam all those monsters, so it's less than half of your deck. But with all those searches, all those effects as special summon, either from the hand or from the graveyard, you can get a lot more monsters on the field that you would normally be able to, and this is why Kinkabayo I think is an insane card, just because it has the great synergy with your Wagtail and your Cobalt Sparrow being able to get those searches. And of course, if you don't need to use this card as link material or as Xyz material, you can just bounce it back during the end phase to your hand because it's a spirit monster, and keep it on the hand as a follow-up play, because sometimes your play is not going to be good enough turn 1 nor to stop your opponent completely, so you do need to make sure that you will be able to play during the following turns as well. So this is why I love that this card has that as well. So I think it's much better than Evil Thorn in the sense that when you use Evil Thorn, yes, you deck thin a little bit more, you do burn for time, which is, if it's something that you're looking for, then you can go for that too, but I just think that Kinkabayo is just a tiny bit better. For the hand traps, play 3 copies of Ash Blossom. This is the only hand trap I play aside from the other one I'm going to show you, which is basically mandatory for this deck, but you can replace this with anything you want. You can play in Prom, which is very budget now. You can play Nibiru if you think you're playing in a format where a lot of combos, a lot of decks of spammer exist, so, but just Ash for this profile because it's the most generic one. And I do play 1 copy of Diddy Crow because you all know this card is searchable. We all remember the good old times with Spiral when they used to summon Recital Starlight and search this card for an extra interruption. So if you know that the matchup is good for this card, then you can just search it and have an extra negate, not negate, but extra interruption this way. So I think if you're playing this deck, you should be playing at least 1 copy of Diddy Crow in the main deck. For the spells, we have 3 copies of Bird Call. This card just made the deck so much better. So first of all, we didn't have any spells for, but now we do. And having a searcher for those cards is actually really good because we did know that those effects that were similar to Cobalt Sparrow could be used for spells and traps as well. So this card, basically, it says that it's either a Roto or a Foolish for a Lyrilusc monster. And then not only that, but it also can special summon a monster with a different name from your hand from the one you searched. So this card can get you access to your Cobalt Sparrow immediately. And depending on your hand, you can either add it to your hand to special summon it with Sapphire Swallow or send it to the graveyard to special summon it with your Canary. So depending on the hand you have, you can choose whichever effect you like. But then you can also summon another monster from your hand. So if you have a Cobalt Sparrow or a Wagtail already in your hand, you can search a Swallow, you can search a Canary, and then special summon the other one, and they will get their effects this way because you special summon them. So this card is absolutely incredible for this deck. It just makes this deck so much better because I remember that we did get the support announced, and this card was not in the first initial cards, and then this card was announced, and I was like, yes, this deck already was good, but now it's absolutely amazing. So this card, I think, makes the deck from a good deck to an amazing deck. So yeah, you absolutely have to max it out. We also play 1 copy of Bird Sanctuary. The only reason you play this is because you won't have another target for your Wagtail in case you draw your Bird Call, because you won't have another search. Since Bird Call is once per turn, you want to be able to get another card. And this card is decent. So first of all, you can target 2 Winged Beast Xyz monsters you control, and you attach one of them with all of its materials to the other one. So the reason this is a really good effect is because firstly, you're going to focus on summoning Recital Starlings to be able to get to some searches so you can get your hand rolling. But then these monsters, either you go for a Utopic Future Dragon or they just stuck there for no reason. This card gives them a use because the more materials you have aside from on top of your Robin and on top of your assembled Nightingale, the more attacks you have and the more bounces you have. So this is why this card gives you more ways to OTK and more ways to interrupt. Also, if you control an Xyz monster with 3 or more materials, you can draw a card. This effect is very easy to trigger in this deck. You should already know this deck is basically just putting as many materials as possible under your monsters. So a free draw, we'll always take it. It's a decent card, so we're gonna play it at 1 just because we can search it. Now, going on to the generic level 1 stuff, we have 3 copies of Wearflow. Like I mentioned, you do have 18 monsters that you want to see in your hand, so you won't be able to search them as consistently as possible, so this is why Wearflow is here. It's a very good card in decks like this, but you should just be careful when you're going into game 3 and you're close to time. You should side this card out because it's very easy to lose to this card when you pay 2000 life points during the end phase, because most of the time you're not going to normal summon the one you search unless you're searching Kikabayo. 3 copies of Jack in the Hand. This is a weird card, but I just really like the concept of it, and I think that is very clutch in a lot of situations. So when you read this card, it can be very confusing, so let me explain what this card does. So you choose 3 level 1 monsters with different names from your deck, and then you show them to your opponent. The first one your opponent is going to choose, and they're going to add to their hand. Then this card just immediately seems like a huge neck, because you just give your opponent a card, right? Well, wrong, because you're giving them a card that, unless you're playing a mirror match, then what are they going to do with it? Unless you reveal Lady Crow, which you should never do it, because you just give them a free interruption for no reason, then the monsters you're going to give them, at the very least, at the very best, they're just going to be a free link material if they choose something like a Turquoise Warbler. But then you get to add 1 to your own hand. So when you show 2 extenders or 2 starters, you're guaranteed at least 1 extender or 1 starter in your hand. Even though your opponent is going to get 1 card too, it doesn't really matter unless they're playing a mirror match. This card is going to be basically useless for them, but you are going to get exactly what you need. So this card is just so good. When you start with it, just make your opponent confused because they don't know what you already have in your hand, so you can sometimes bait them into giving you the card you want. So this is why sometimes when you reveal a Warbler and a Kikabayo, if they think that, okay, a Warbler is going to be a bigger plus because it doesn't commit to a normal summon, and then I'm going to choose this so that I can take it Kikabayo, maybe you already have another way to get to a special summon and you really wanted the Kikabayo, so this is why this card can go for a lot of mind games, and I really love this card in the deck. And for the one-offs, play of course 1 copy of 1 for 1. I mean, this card is the freest plus ever in this deck. 1 copy of Instant Fusion, you know, restrict, you can play Millennium Eyes, you can play 1000 Eyes. I prefer 1000 Eyes in this deck because, but I'll explain once I get to the extra deck, yeah. 1 copy of Foolish Burial, another way to get to Cobalt Sparrow to the graveyard because you want to do that as fast as possible. 1 copy of Monster Reborn, another extender, then when you combine this with Wagtail or Sparrow, you just get free pluses. And 1 copy of Call by the Grave because sometimes some hand traps can be very hurtful, especially Ash when you get hit to your bird call, because when your hand has a lot of monsters that are usually of the same type, I mean, when I say the same type, I mean either starters or extenders, because you can just categorize half of those monsters are like that. When you open too many of one category and you want to search the other, if they ask the search, then this can hurt sometimes. And the only trap I play in the deck is 3 copies of Harpy's Featherstorm. This is the card that just makes or breaks decks like this, because decks like Harpies or other decks that can use this card just get a huge advantage compared to other decks, just because this card, when used defensively, they just completely shut down your opponent's turn unless they're playing a deck that doesn't rely on monsters a lot, but nowadays the meta just relies on monsters mostly. So when you control a Wing Beast, you can just basically negate any activated effect of your opponents. They just can't do anything. Basically, this card stops their turn. But the cool thing is that if you control a Harpy monster, you can activate this card from your hand. Now you're basically thinking, how can you control a Harpy monster in a deck that is not Harpies? Well, there is a Harpy Link monster that does not require Harpies to summon, it requires wind monsters to make. So sometimes when you're going first, if you know that your opponent is going to have hand traps, or if you're afraid of a card like Nibiru, because this deck does lose to Nibiru because it does spam a lot, then the first 2 monsters you summon, instead of committing to an XC summon, you can make that Harpy Link monster, and then if you have this card in your hand, you're basically safe for all the hand traps. And then when you finish your combos, you can link away 2 more monsters with that Link monster for an Appaloosa, get more interruptions, and by the time you have Appaloosa on the field, Nibiru is totally useless, because the very best that Nibiru is going to do is decrease Appaloosa's attack points by 800, and that's basic. So this card, when you draw it, you're just gonna have such a huge advantage. It's very tempting to even play Trap Trick just because of how good this card is, but I think it's a little bit overkill. Of course, you can do it if you feel like you need to, but I think if you only have 1 target, Trap Trick sometimes is a little bit meh, unless that target is Sanctum, but we're not playing Sanctum in a deck like this. So yeah, this card is just such a huge plus for winged decks, and I think that any deck that should abuse it absolutely must. For the extra deck, we have 2 copies of Assembled Nightingale. This card is basically the win button of the deck. When you're trying to go for game, the only thing you need to do is make this card attack enough times with the boost that it has in order to go for game. So this card basically gains 200 attack for each Xyz material it has. It requires 2 or more level 1 monsters, so you can basically give her as many as you want, and there are other ways to equip materials with a continuous spell and with the effects like Wagtail and Swallow. So yeah, this card just attacks as many times as many materials as it has directly. So when you boost it and you give it enough materials, it's very easy to OTK. And of course, you know that an Xyz monster that can attack directly. If this card doesn't OTK, you basically know what's coming next. We have 2 copies of Recital Starlight. Sometimes you summon him with both of them during the first play, and then you go into Utopic Future and Utopic Future Draco. So this forces your opponent to either Nibiru when you summon your Utopic Future, otherwise then you're going to have a negate on the field and then you can end on that, which basically means that your opponent is going to have to deal with a really big monster that is very hard to deal with and can negate affect monsters and steal them as well. But of course, sometimes you don't want to stop there, so this is why I mentioned the play with Harpy's Featherstorm. You want to do even more. Basically, how this deck plays around Nibiru is by not committing everything to the board, just checking the waters, ending on mediocre fields, and then saying if you can play around it, then good, and if you don't, then you should not commit everything because otherwise you're going to lose next turn. So this card just searches you your monsters, and it also has an effect that when it's XE summoned, you boost a monster with 300 attack and defense for each material attached to this card. So this is another way to boost your assembled Nightingale to go for more damage, and it also has a clutch effect that is basically inflicts the battle damage you take from battles involving this XE summon card to your opponent as well. So sometimes you can get some cheeky damage with this, and it's possible to get a draw with this card, but it's very, very unlikely, but it's just a possibility. So you should keep that in mind in case it comes up. 2 copies of Robin. This card, I think, is the most hype XE monster that we've gotten in such a long time for a specific archetype, just because when you read this card, it feels so powerful. So what this card does is, of course, it's another monster that requires 2 or more level 1 monsters. It gains 500 attack for each material, so it's a lot bigger than an assembled Nightingale, because when you give this card 4 and 5 materials, instead of having 1000 attack like assembled Nightingale, it's going to have 2000 and 2500, so it's going to be a little bit harder to deal with. But the good thing about this card is that when your opponent special summons a monster, you can just detach a material and bounce that monster to the hand. And this is not a once per turn effect. So basically, you can just keep bouncing your opponent's monster. So as long as they don't normal summon something and attack over this card, then you can just keep bouncing their monsters over and over and over again. They won't be able to combo off, they won't be able to do anything. It also has another effect that if it's sent to the graveyard by your opponent, you can target another Lyrilusc in your graveyard and you add it to your hand. So even if your opponent deals with it, you can just basically get back your Canary and then have a follow-up, which is very easy to go for the following turn. So this card is just the one you're going to be focusing on summoning when you're going first, with as many materials as possible, maybe backing it up with your Yugioh Future Draco, maybe with a set Harpy's Featherstorm. The deck is not the most explosive deck when it comes to making unbreakable boards. It just makes a mid-ranged board and then tries to OTK during the following turn, which is why I love this deck, because I feel like decks like this just make the most fun games, because they don't focus on ending turn 1 the game, because you just have so many interruptions on the field. Sometimes it happens, because sometimes your opponent can just cannot deal with a card like this, but this deck can just create so many weird situations where you have to grind and you have to summon more monsters. 1 copy of Lyrilusc Prom Thrush. This card is a card that's basically a back row hate kind of card, and the deck does need some type of card like this, just because against certain matchups this deck can struggle a lot. So this card is another monster that requires 2 plus level 1 monsters. It gains 500 attack for each material, and once per turn you detach a material, target spell and trap your opponent controls, and you shuffle into the deck. And when it battles, you can detach any number of materials from this card, and your battling monster is going to gain 300 attack for each material detached from this card. So this is another boosting effect. It also bounces the spell and trap back into the deck, so you don't have to deal with it later unless your opponent draws it again. So just 1 copy of this card, because sometimes you're going to face matchups like Subterror, like Altergeist. You need to be able to have something at least in the extra deck in order to be able to deal with it, and then let your side deck deal with it after. 1 copy of Downer Magician. Of course, you already know this combo. We've seen it in Drytron before, when they summon assembled and then they attack directly, they make Downer on top, and then they make the 1 copy of Zeus we have here with 4 materials, because otherwise if you don't play Downered, you would have to commit another material into your assembled Nightingale in order to be able to activate Zeus's effect twice. Sometimes with this deck it's even possible to activate this effect 3 times, basically like playing a Zodiac Engine. Not as free, but still really good. So yeah, Zeus I think is a broken card for decks like this, and as long as it's not banned, we're just gonna keep playing it, of course. 1 copy of Utopic Future and 1 copy of Draco Future. This card is just very easy to make with the Recital Starlight. You basically get 2 searches, so it's not like you neg your Xyz monsters, you replace the monsters and then you summon even more, and then you get a free negate on the field and a monster that is very healthy. 1 copy of Thousand Eyes Restrict. You can play Millennium instead of this if you want, but I feel like sometimes against certain decks, Millennium doesn't do the best thing going second, just because it's very easy to play around, because they see it coming. So this card, not only does it force a monster right away, it doesn't wait for your opponent to actually go and waste a negate on something, so this card just forces negates, and also when you go into the 1 copy of Anima, you can force sometimes multiple negates if your opponent has a monster under the extra monster zone. But of course, I think Millennium also has its uses, because going first, I said some hand traps can hurt, but you can choose whichever one you want, or if you think you can find space and cut another card, you can play both. But I think that just committing 2 slots for an extra deck for a card that is limited, being instant fusion and it's unsearchable, I don't think is that worth it. You're not going to see it too often, so I think these 2 cards here just make the deal perfect. 1 copy of Harpy Conductor. This is a reason Featherstorm, like I mentioned before, is such a broken card, because this card requires 2 wind monsters. So if you commit 2 monsters into this when you have your Featherstorm going first in your hand, you can activate it from your hand and basically negate any type of hand trap, and I mean, except impermanence, of course, it has to be a monster effect, but especially negating Nibiru is what you're aiming for when you're going for this play, because this deck loses to Nibiru, so you need to be able to play around it. it and make all your interruptions. And of course, after you've summoned everything else, after you summon your Robin, after you get your Surges, then you can link 2 other monsters with your Harpy Conductor into your 1 copy of Appaloosa, and then the Nibiru is basically useless. If they want to activate it, all they're doing is decrease this card's attack points by 800, and then you have even more interruptions, so it's not like ending on a useless monster being Harpy Conductor, which doesn't offer anything in this particular deck other than being able to activate further stuff in the hand. So this is why Appaloosa is here, and you don't really need to play anything else as a rank 4, as a link 4, because this deck does not need cards like Boral Sword or Access Code to go big damage. You rely on Assemble Nightingale and Zeus to go for that. So yeah, that's the deck, guys. I think that this deck has just become an insane type of deck, and I'm pretty sure that when we get the big ban list that we're all waiting for, maybe it's going to be this ban list, maybe it's going to be next ban list, who knows, this deck is going to be a really good tier 2 contender, because right now it might be struggle against the best decks, but if the format just cuts down a little bit and slows down more, then this deck just has the potential to overthrow it and win a lot of games. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and we'll see you next time.